When God wanted to use someone to defeat an enemy of Israel, he called Gideon. The Midianite raiders had reduced the nation of Israel to starvation. They stole their food, destroyed their livelihood, and intimidated their people. Therefore, Israel cried out to the Lord for help. Gideon was God's solution, because God always uses a man or a woman. He probably seemed like a most unlikely character to use. He was faint-hearted and defeated. As a result, he was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide his grain from the Midianites. Although Gideon's vision was limited, he was committed to providing for his family. He turned the winepress into a sunken threshing floor. It had no ventilation to blow the chaff away. It was a dusty, sweaty, cowering existence, but at least he could feed his family while staying hidden from the Midianites. I would imagine that this was a little like living in a box. He was certainly boxed in. Despite the limited success of Gideon's defensive strategy, God came to him and called him to step up to greater things, to move forward. God was calling him out of the winepress. Sometimes we may feel we are already doing something significant, but God is leading us to a larger purpose. We need to heed his inner promptings. He is trying to get us out of our limiting situation and move us on to greater things. You see, Gideon was in the winepress with a small vision of feeding his family, but God was leading him to the greater vision of rescuing the whole nation. Gideon took quite a bit of convincing to get out of the winepress and to enter this bigger vision. To confirm that this was really God speaking to him, he set out not one, but 2 fleeces. He wanted to be fully convinced that God was truly with him. Thankfully, God graciously confirmed his call with that second miracle. Consequently, Gideon could not mistake the fact that God was speaking to him, calling him out. Timid Gideon could no longer hide behind the excuse that he wasn't really hearing God's voice, because he was. Perhaps God is calling you out, but you haven't yet realized that it is his voice calling you to greater, more significant things. Gideon was very fearful of launching out. He could only see his weaknesses and his limitations. This reluctant deliverer had already tried to convince God that he was not the right choice. He argued with God that his clan was the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh and that he was the least of his entire family. How often do we use family as an excuse? Saying things like, "Oh, my family has never done anything of significance, let alone me." This God-ordained mighty hero was scared of stepping out of his safe place. All the while, God was speaking words of encouragement to him. He was addressing Gideon's fear. God called him a mighty man of valor and commanded him to go in his supernatural strength. The very words that God spoke were the carriers of his power, grace, and enabling. God was speaking what would come to pass at the point of obedience. God cannot lie. He will fulfill what he says. God himself was strengthening Gideon. All he had to do was obey the call to action. We should never focus on our ability, never focus on our weaknesses or even our strengths to do something if God is calling us to do it. At that point, we need to believe that his word is true rather than trusting our natural ability to do it. God wasn't expecting his called and anointed deliverer to go in his own strength. We must remember that principle. When God calls us to go, it is his words that provide us with the power to obey. We go in his strength, not our own. When God speaks, he empowers. The weakest of the weak are empowered to win when he commands and they obey. So Gideon and his army got up early and went. Gideon obeyed, and he certainly went in the wisdom and strength that God provided. Even as Gideon was forming the army to fight, he had to eliminate all those who were fearful. God wanted to prove that he was fighting the battle, so he told Gideon to reduce the army from 32,000 people down to 300. That's a huge reduction. Gideon and this tiny army could not take the credit for the victory. God caused the Midianites to have a dream, and when the 300 blew their horns and broke jars, they merely watched as the Midianites rushed around in panic. The Lord caused the warriors in the camp to fight against each other with their swords. They were confused and they were terrified. Those who avoided dying in this frenzied infight fled in disorderly retreat, leaving all their provisions and valuables behind. Because of this amazing move of God, Israel regained what they had lost and much more. Gideon had been afraid at first, and the odds were quite overwhelming. But God encouraged him along the way, and he did receive the victory. Sometimes we just have to get out of the box, break through the limiting boundaries, and take the first step of obedience. Then, as we keep moving forward, God will give us the strength for each advancing stride. Thanks for listening. This is Rosanna Palmer.